Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 8th, 2021, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. We have a great guest for you today. We're going to be talking about podcasting and science and kind of getting into some fun debates. But before we dive in, I want to tell you that change is afoot. So I, at the sort of urging, gentle and kind urging of my incredible community of podcast patrons on Patreon, I've been thinking quite a lot about how to shake things up and how to make sure that everybody who pledges their support of the show and who promotes the show and sponsors the show individually financially is really getting their money's worth. And one of the ways to do that is to shake up my tiers on Patreon. So those of you who aren't patrons yet, I hope that in hearing what I'm about to say, you might consider joining this really vibrant community. Those of you who already are patrons, don't worry, you're not going to lose anything. You're only going to gain things. So let's talk about this. If you go to patreon.com/talknerdy, you will learn all about it. But as of today, we are pushing live an entirely new Patreon system. If you pledge $1 per episode, as before, you will be a friend of Talk Nerdy. And of course, a virtual hug will be sent your way. You have to imagine it a little bit. That's kind of how virtual hugs work. But I do thank you from the bottom of my heart. But if you up just to $2 per episode, that's where things start to get interesting. As one of the coolest people on the planet, you will now get an ad-free version of the show. No more host-read ads, no more dynamic ads, which are, endlessly important to help me get paid, to help me pay the team of people who work tirelessly with me, including my assistant, Noelle, and the editors that work on my show. So, ads are still going to exist for the bulk of people who listen to the show, but you will have your own feed that you can download and listen to an ad-free version of the show, but you'll only be able to access it on Patreon if you are a $2 per episode or above member. Climbing the ranks from coolest person on the planet to coolest person in the solar system. At the $10 level, you'll get access to the Discord server, to my own Talk Nerdy channel, where you can, of course, commune with like-minded people. If you're already on Patreon, you know how fun Discord can be. You can set up channels, you can chat with one another. I'll pop in periodically, so we'll know well. We can answer your questions, get your insights, and your recommendations. It's going to be a blast. Then at $25, being, the coolest person in now the galaxy, you will continue to get the same perks, which include a shout out at the very top of the show. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you. I will be giving your shout out in a second. And then finally, at the highest tier, $50 or more per episode, and I have a few of you, and oh my goodness, are you amazing. We're going to change things up and offer an opportunity for face-to-face live chats. So, obviously because of COVID, this is going to be done online, but we'll either within this very small group of people have periodic chats together where we can talk things out. I can, again, get recommendations. We can kind of just shoot the shit. Or maybe if the schedules are too conflicting, because we're all over the globe, we can do some one-on-ones. We're going to figure that out as we go, and I'm going to get your input on that. But these are the new tiers. These are the new amazing perks, and I really hope that you'll consider pledging your support. Again, if you're interested, just go to patreon.com/talknerdy. So let's give a shout out to my coolest people in the galaxy. They include, Frederick Fast Markison. And if I'm pronouncing that wrong, you'll have an opportunity to tell me soon. Rob Schreck, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Krister Jansen, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, David J.E. Smith, June Sapara, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart. All right. It's a little more business at the top than usual, but it's important and exciting. I hope you're just excited as I am. So now let's dive into this week's episode. I have the opportunity to sit down, remotely of course, with Wendy Zukerman, the host of Science Versus. You know Science Versus. You already listened to the show. If you don't, Science Versus takes on fads, trends, and the opinionated mob to find out what's fact, what's not, and what's somewhere in between. They have an amazing team of reporters and producers, but the host and executive producer of Science Versus is Wendy Zukerman. Previously, she worked for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, that ABC, where she originally created Science Versus. She studied law and biomedical science in school. She's written for a ton of outlets like New Scientist, Cosmos Magazine, the Australian, and Saturday Paper. She's won a ton of journalism awards for her amazing work on the podcast. And, the episodes really range in content. We talk about a few of them on the show, but they really range in content. Most recent episode is about chronic pain, episodes about burnout, about therapy, about, just like what is the science behind these important topics. Wendy is just an absolute joy to chat with. And just to reinforce, because it's important for me to tell you, I think in 2015, Science Versus moved over to Gimlet Media, and it is now a Spotify original. So if you don't already, listen to Science Versus on Spotify. Subscribe today. Without any further ado, here she is, Wendy Zukerman. Well, Wendy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to a fellow podcaster, to talk to somebody who is, I think, equally, if not more passionate. I don't know if that's possible. So I'll say equally passionate about science. And I thought before we even dive into anything else, maybe you could, just at the very, very top, give us a rundown of Science Versus.
Sure. So Science Versus is a podcast that takes the issues that you care about, hopefully, whether it's something as serious as chronic pain to as fun as magic mushrooms. And then we kind of dive into the science on it and tell you, are these things as good as you think they are when it comes to magic mushrooms? Do they really cure depression, as some people on the internet say? Or is that a lie? And then we also look at things that might seem really scary and ask, are they really that scary? And the show's been running for about 6 years. We're on our 11th season now, and we're part of Gimlet Media.
And so you started off, so you worked for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and that's where you first developed, because Science Versus is really your brainchild, isn't it?
Yeah. And I came up with it at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I have to be very careful because ABC has different meanings in the US. So at the time, so this was 2015, back in the dark ages. And the Australian Broadcasting Corporation was looking into doing podcasts. They made radio for a long time and kind of chopped it up and put it online, but didn't make dedicated podcasts, which does feel like the dark ages of podcasts. That back then, only 6 years ago, the ABC was like, "Oh, should we experiment with this thing called a podcast?" And now it's such a part of the media, of science journalism as well. And they knew at the ABC that science radio generally did very well. And so I was approached to come up with an idea for a science show. And it just so happened that week or something, Gwyneth Paltrow had suggested that women steam clean their vaginas. Do you remember?
Oh yes. This was, it topped only maybe by the jade eggs.
Right. We didn't think she could go any higher. But then, the gift that keeps on giving, Gwyneth Paltrow. And so at the time, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to do a show called, Science Versus Gwyneth Paltrow, where we take these ideas that seem completely bonkers, but obviously not bonkers to that many people, because some people were like, should I be steam cleaning my vagina? And we look at the science behind it. And so that's what I wanted to do. And I wanted to tell science stories with humor and make it fun and not make it feel like homework. And then that's, I don't know, this is history. What is that phrase? And there goes history or something.
Right. And that's what she wrote. I love that, and it's funny because one thing that you mentioned when you were telling me that sort of was like, oh, okay, like a little triggering for me as a science journalist. Well, it's funny. I call myself that. I don't even think I'm that anymore. But as a fellow podcaster, I also started my podcast in 2015 here in the States. And when you were like, in Australia, science radio did very well. And I was like, that that is not the case here. And so like I feel like my starts were very different because I'm constantly feel like we're swimming upstream here and trying to justify. And of course now you are part of the American media landscape as well. Working with Gimlet Media, but like, do you not feel the same pressure and the same stress of like constantly trying to swim upstream and convince people why it matters that we do what we do?
No, I definitely feel that. And the only time that I haven't felt that is at the beginning of the pandemic. That was really one of the moments where people were so appreciative of science. And I know the anti-science movement gets a lot of time and space in the media, but the truth is that there were a lot of people who just wanted to know, what does science know about this virus? How can I keep myself safe? How can I keep my family safe? And when we were sort of running down the facts on what little do we know about this virus, so many people were emailing us and saying, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, because there's so much guff online. I just want to know the facts. And we really didn't have to spend much time telling people, you should love science because it's amazing and it helps us understand the world and helps us understand yourself, and you don't need to make up lies. There's so much work, as you said, that goes into explaining to people why science is important. But during the pandemic, particularly at the beginning, I felt like people really understood that and wanted to know what was going on. There was also obviously people who were just, I don't even know what to make of those who kind of went on their own tangents and preferred to listen to the strong men online. I presume it is because it is much more comforting to have someone say, here's what is the truth, rather than to have some science journalists go, the truth is we're still working it out and we don't really know, but here's what we think.
Right. And there's a little bit of a gray area over here, and it is this, but it's also that. And let's hold our breath. Yeah.
Exactly. And the world is more complicated, but I see why you would get comfort from this idea that whatever hydrochloroquine is the cure. So yes, but I shouldn't pretend that in Australia, to go back to your question, that in Australia we're not always fighting to prove that science is cool. I think that the real, when I said science radio does well in Australia, it's probably referring to kind of the fun part of science, like the quirky, if I piss on a lemon tree, is it good for the lemon tree kind of science? Yeah. That goes very well. I mean, I enjoy that too, but so does the Australian audience.
And so tell me about the shift over. I don't even know if shift over is a good way to put it, but when you first sort of joined Gimlet Media, when you were able to develop a big team, like I can imagine that, I started in 2015 also. It's still like just me. But I have an assistant that I work with, and then I hire an editing team that, is a professional podcast editing team that doesn't just work with me. They work with a lot of different podcasts, but I hire them to help me just because, it's a lot of work and I'm doing other things. But you have an entire team, like a decent team that you work with. You've got, an audio engineer and a composer. You've got 2 audio engineers and composers. You've got editors, producers. So tell me about that kind of the development of being able to really take Science Versus and make it into something that's a polished sort of machine.
It's been a big learning curve on some like very sort of personal levels, going from it just basically being me, and then I had an editor for a couple of hours a week back in Australia, to then this huge team that you mentioned, like a machine. I'd never been a boss before. I'd never been, it's sort of funny because I had this, I don't want to sound like a wanker, but I had this like vision for what I wanted Science Versus to be. And then part of being the leader of a team, you're trying to get everyone on board with that vision. And I hadn't really thought about the kind of emotional toll of that, because we were hiring, sometimes journalists, sometimes science journalists. Now we just have basically dedicated science journalists. But people want to tell stories in all kinds of different ways. I want to tell it with a lot of humor, and I don't want to take myself too seriously. Take the science very seriously, not myself. At the beginning, we had people on the team that wanted to be super earnest about the science. They wanted to tackle, capital I important things. And I'd be like, Dad, it's important, but do I really want to spend 3 months of my life digging down the science of, whatever it was. And, maybe sure we shouldn't just tackle magic mushrooms. I wanted and so that was a big effort to sort of get a team that was behind the vision and then able to execute it. That was really hard. But it's also been really wonderful because now, like, the facts of the show, we're so tight about making sure that everything we talk about, we're telling the truth. I mean, back when it was just me, the shows were shorter, and I would desperately read as much science as I could, but I needed to pump out the show once a week while we were in season, which is a lot of work, a lot of science. But that's why I made the episodes shorter. But now, because we have this big team, we have dedicated fact checker, we can go longer, we can tackle bigger issues. And that's been super, super fun. I sleep so much easier now that I have this amazing team of fact checkers and science journalists behind me. So I'm like, yes, okay. We hit publish on something and I feel really confident in the science that we've just given our audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what's your range of sort of time on your episodes? How long do you try to net them out at?
So for big, complicated ones, it really depends. So, for example, this chronic pain episode that's coming out this week, this has been produced by Nick Delrose and Rose Rimler. So she's going to be hosting it. And they started this 3-4 months ago, just starting to kind of dip their toes in the science as a personal story. Nick has been suffering from chronic pain for a really long time, so he'd been kind of looking into the research before then. But in terms of really sort of nutting out what our episode was going to be, that was probably 3 months. Then on the other side, during the coronavirus, when we were doing, I shouldn't say during, we're still in it,
right?
While we were doing the season, our coronavirus season, just at the beginning of the pandemic, then we were pumping out episodes within sort of 48 hours, basically, because at the beginning, it's kind of hard to think back, but it was so, the misinformation was so thick and fast. It was really, every day I'd go online and there was something else that people were saying. At one point, I think we all thought we were asymptomatic carriers of coronavirus.
Oh yeah, for sure. That we were all just spreading it all around.
Exactly. I mean, I can't count the amount of antibody tests that I got being like, I'm sure. It's me, when we didn't know. And then there was hydrochloroquine and then there was this. And then there was that.
Maybe if I just shine a light inside my body.
Of course. There was, yes. Oh my God. And drinking bleach and, and then there was the pandemic YouTube video and everyone,
the pandemic.
Oh my God. I know. And it just went on and on. And so to get that, we just felt this huge sense of responsibility to try and get the facts out as quickly as possible. So then we were producing episodes within, like I said, 48 hours.
Right. And even though that was so much, I can imagine that's so much brutal work. At the same time, some of the conspiracy theories around the pandemic were so ludicrous that it actually didn't take much to debunk them. Like, I can imagine that some things require a lot of really deep, intensive research to try and describe it or debunk it, depending on, what your stance is with that topic. And other things are a little bit easier to be like, well, but no. It's a pretty quick thing.
Yes. Yes,
we didn't do extra frustrating.
Yeah, we didn't do the drinking bleach because it would have been a very short episode, right? And I think it was tackled very well elsewhere online. But even topics that, like the idea that this escaped from a lab. I mean, that was a classic one that still people today are like, but what about the origins of the virus? And that episode, in some ways, we could have quickly debunked it. But what was more interesting to me was looking at why scientists were sure that this virus wasn't cooked up in a lab, that they could analyze the genetic sequence of the virus and they could see, this just doesn't make any sense. I can't see a human fingerprint in this genetic code. Like, that was super interesting to dive into those details rather than just being like, this is, you're silly. This is a silly video. So that was a real fun one, despite originally the whole team being like, do we really need to jump into this?
Yeah. No, I love that. And so, it's interesting. Partially, I'm asking you a lot of these questions from a very sort of I don't know, selfish personal perspective. I often back in the days when I first started my podcast, I remember I'd get really positive feedback and everybody's really warm and lovely. And then every so often you get a bad review. And the bad reviews usually go something like this. Cara asks a lot of questions and talks about herself on her show. And then I'm like, well, yeah, because it's my effing show. So deal with it. And so one of the things that I notice about the way that I podcast is that I talk about things that are interesting to me. And I just, if people come along for the ride and they also find them interesting, cool. But otherwise, it really is sort of a weird flex for me that I'm like, okay, this is fascinating. I want to learn more about it. And so partially I'm asking you some of these questions because I'm sort of comparing and contrasting in my mind and trying to learn more. I'm always just fascinated by other people's processes. And one of the things that I do with my show, is I try to keep the workload as low as possible because I'm doing so many other things. I'm working on my PhD, I'm doing television work, I have other jobs. And so I do pure interview shows. I have somebody on, like you are right now. I talk to you for the hour. If the editor needs to do a little bit of cleanup, great. I actually try to keep that down to a minimum because I don't want to overproduce my episodes so that they no longer sound like the way people talk. Whereas you take a very different tack now because you have an entire team and your episodes are based around a question or based around a concept or an idea or a topic. Mine are based around a person and their work or a book that they wrote or something that they produced for the world. And so the topics are guided in a different way. Yours sounds like so much more work.
Yes, we don't need to to compare the hard work that we're both doing, but it is a lot of work to produce an episode. Yes, we're often interviewing for academics. Editing just picking our favorite moments in the interviews and then putting a whole bunch of research around it. So, we release our transcript, which has all of our citations, and it often goes over 100, is a script easily over 100 in many cases, because we really try to make sure every sentence is perfectly fact-checked. So yes, it is a different way of making a show. And in the way that you bring yourself into each episode, it's kind of interesting. I have not done that traditionally on the show. So I've really tried to keep my personal experience out of it. So, and I think it's just different ways of making the show. I think part of it is that I don't like to give too much of myself, just generally. Like I guess I'm old school like that in terms of my privacy. So I've always had this sort of question around how much do I want to give away. But I also, I think because I'm so nervous about a lot of media being about the host rather than about something a little bigger. So it's just different ways of kind of communicating science, because I do see the value in a personality that the audience loves and is like, oh, well, I love Cara and I love her personal journey. And plus I'm going to get a little bit of extra science. Great. Like I'm hooked. So that's kind of one way. That's how you're doing it. And I see the complete value. But for me in the work that I wanted to do, I just wanted to make it a little more about the science. And then the way that I'm kind of used in the show is to just kind of bring little humor to make sure that we're explaining the science in a fun a way as possible.
Right. So right there, you've got a leg up because you're funny. So that's helpful.
I don't know. But I have I've wondered what is the best way to do it, because, when we think of the worst examples of people whose the personality cults around, say, Joe Rogan,
exactly.
He has huge influence, and he has in more recent times used that for bad.
For bad. And it's funny because I think that like a full disclosure, when I first started my podcast, and other people might know this, I'll keep it really brief, but this story, I was working in television and I was working more in the capacity that you described, like doing kind of more clean science journalism. And I mean, I'm still working in TV, but I was doing a regular daily show. And, it wasn't about me, nor should it have been. I was presenting the news and presenting these different topics. But I was also working for an executive producer who was like horrifically sexist, who was like gaslighting. There was a lot of really difficult problems on set with a lot of the women who worked on the show. And it was a really not healthy environment for me or for many of my female colleagues. And at the time, randomly, I went on Joe Rogan's podcast. And again, this was in 2015. Yeah. And he was like,
wow, he brought a woman on the show?
Yeah, I know, right? Like very different back then. I had actually been on his show twice. And he was like, Cara, you should start a podcast. Like, this is a place where you can be your own producer, where you can make sure that the topics that you want to dive into, the areas where you want to focus, like you're not beholden to the network, you're not beholden to the advertisers, you're not beholden to any of these things. And at the time, it really resonated with me. And I started a podcast. So it's so funny that the same person who saw this, I think, very important thing for sort of making space for different voices has gone to a very dark place. And you're right. It's been within the past, I'd say 3-4 years, just probably in the Trump era and pandemic era is where I've seen a big shift into this very sort of intellectual dark web space that's been quite dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it just does speak to the power of using personality to bring people along to ideas, whether they're good or bad.
And I think a lack of a scientific compass as well, a lack of respect for the scientific process and a true understanding of what science can be and also the limits of science.
Yes.
I think is when your guiding force is something that makes you feel good, or it's something that reinforces your previously held beliefs, or it's something instead of a more scientific hypothesis testing sort of MO, I think you can get into a lot of trouble. And that's what we see politically around the world.
Exactly. I think it's just to broaden it out away from Joe Rogan, but I think it does go back to the comfort that a strong voice, and I don't mean that like a male voice, although it
but like a charismatic leader, that kind of thing.
A charismatic leader that's just giving comfort and saying things, just saying things as if they are known is so much more comfortable. And so saying CBD is proven to do all these things, and if you have these problems, then you should try this. That's obviously incredibly comfortable if you have those problems and you're going to give it a go. And I think that's why we see so much of this, and it is a lack of understanding of. I don't know. It is really sad, and it's been interesting to watch what's happening in Brazil, because for so long the strong leader was going great guns for him, and now it's all come crashing down in a sort of interesting way. That I wonder if that's going to be a model for what happens elsewhere, where we see the dangers of not trusting science. In some ways, I thought the pandemic was going to do that, because it's literally you and your family, particularly if you've got grandparents, it's their life on the line. So how could you not trust science? But I don't know whether we have seen the turning point on that yet. So maybe this story is just in the middle.
No, you're right. I recently had, what was her name? She was on quite recently on my show. I did a full hour with, there she is, Natalia Pasternak, who has been a really outspoken advocate for science and for evidence-based policy in Brazil. So we did a whole, episode about Brazilian pseudoscience, and good God, is it scary. And you're right. Like, it does seem like there's been some table turning. She testified before the Senate in that very famed hearing that now is having these outcomes that we were talking about. But it's interesting to see that in a place where Bolsonaro could have such a stranglehold on policy, there's still an undercurrent of basic, trust in scientific authority. And so, like, you push beyond the pale and something breaks, whereas I'm not sure I'm seeing that here in the States.
I know. Have we not?
Me.
Has the pale not broken yet?
I know,
that the problem?
Right?
Like, was the coronavirus not deadly enough?
Or was it just that Trump was so good at developing a new normal, at doing this very Orwellian thing where each new terrible thing was so normalized that eventually we came to expect it. And that there was such a concerted effort to dismantle trust in things like the media, the scientific authority, even, sometimes political authority, that ultimately, like, he laid the groundwork first. He didn't just come out guns blazing going, coronavirus, it's fake, it's a hoax. He really set up a structure that would then reinforce that kind of rhetoric. And I don't know if Bolsonaro did that. I don't know, but it's scary. It's really scary.
It is. And I'm thinking about it in the context of climate change as well, because what I think actually, I'm terrible at predicting the future, just to put this in context. When
we got to get Rose Eveleth on the show. She's good at predicting the future.
Exactly. Like as a prime example of how bad I am at predicting the future, when the coronavirus was just starting to, we were just hearing about it in the US, my boss, Alex Bloomberg, said, do you think we should stop having the shared candy? Like we had M&Ms in a giant bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, nah, this'll be fine.
Right.
What? So with that huge caveat, my prediction about what is going to happen with climate change, where we've obviously seen a huge amount of denial for a very long time, but now as we're seeing more and more fires, more and more flooding, it's getting more and more drought. It's getting harder and harder to deny. And I think we are seeing the tables turning in terms of action from governments. Obviously, very frustrating how slow it's come, but we are seeing it. In Australia, for example, where we have a conservative leader who has done diddly squat for climate, even as the nation was on fire, is now starting to make a plan for climate change. And what we're going to see, I think, is we're never going to get an apology. Sorry, we knew this decades ago. We saw this coming, should have acted faster. Instead, what I think the Conservatives are going to start saying is, well, the science is in now, isn't it? Yes, that we know now. They weren't sure before, but now that the science is solid, it's time to act on it. And it's that sort of weird sort of mental gymnastics that I think happens because all sides want facts. Like the word science is somewhat politicized, but everyone is trying to say, I have the evidence behind me for what I'm saying. To go back to Joe Rogan, he does have scientists on his show that are sometimes slightly renegade or a little bit too excited about the research when
or
it doesn't
sometimes legitimate, and that's where it's extra confusing to people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, but they, like, even those characters are saying, like, no, I've got the evidence. Everyone wants the evidence. Everyone understands that that's important for the story and important for their own justification of whatever they believe in. And so I think that's how it's going to turn. And I don't know, it's just incredibly frustrating because obviously when I don't need an apology, I just need action.
Right. It's, we were kind of discussing this. I work on another podcast, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And one of the things we were just talking about when we were recording yesterday, we record on Wednesdays and today it's a Thursday that we're talking. One of the things that we were just talking about was this sort of, one of the co-hosts was like, I expected herd immunity by now. And God, this is really because we just can't, get our shit together and blah, blah, blah. And, who's saying the anti-vaxxers are dragging their heels or people just haven't come around. And sort of the pushback was, well, no, we actually have seen that as the pandemic has become more salient to individuals in this country, as more and more people have gotten sick and died from the pandemic, more and more people have, of course, woken up to the severity of this problem. And vaccine campaigns are working. They're just, working slower than we would like here in this country, of course. And so you see the media sort of representations of individuals in the hospital going, guys, I was wrong. I shouldn't have put out that TikTok video. This is real. This is dangerous. And I'm about to be put on a vent and I could die. Go get vaxxed. But then you also see that very small percentage of the entrenched people who are like dying in the hospital and still saying, well, I still wouldn't get the vaccine. And those are the people who, A, confuse the hell out of me, but B, I think we do a bad job in this country of highlighting them and giving them more space than they actually represent within the milieu.
Oh, I thought you wanted to give them more space.
No. Like, I think that the problem is that those people get so much airtime that we think they're representative of a way bigger portion of the population than they are.
No, it's true. Because, vaccination rates, for example, in New York, we're doing quite well here. I guess that's kind of an obvious one.
And same in LA. Yeah, we're doing quite well, but, not in all parts of the country. You and I, we represent the extremes, I think.
I do think you're right. I think that people, what's been interesting to see with the vaccination story is I was really frustrated with a lot of the reporting around when the vaccines were first coming online, where there was all these stories about, people don't want to get a vaccine. There's all this vaccine hesitancy, all this anti-vax, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, this is not the same thing as what's happening with like the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. This is literally a vaccine that has just come online. I totally get why people have questions about it. Sometimes that reporting was happening before we even had vaccines. We did a survey of 1,000 Americans and they're not sure if they'll get the vaccine. I was like, yeah, because we don't have one yet and we don't have any data on it. This is ridiculous.
Hypothetical poll. Yeah.
Exactly. With a hypothetical vaccine. I was like, what? Like me who loves science, loves vaccines, like would not take a hypothetical vaccine. I read the articles. We reported on them about, the safety profile was great when we eventually got the results. And then exactly, this is one where I did predict the future. As soon as we started getting data showing how effective they were, how safe they were, and then more and more people got vaccinated, vaccine hesitancy dropped and dropped and dropped. And yes, we've still got that hardcore group that, as you mentioned, we're not at 100%. But I do think there was this reporting about vaccine hesitancy. And I'm like, oh, come on. Like, how can you expect people to say they're going to take a vaccine that doesn't even exist yet?
Yeah, it's true, and I think that, it's...
And again, and then what was annoying, this really gets me, Cara, but the annoying thing was then they did it again with the kids, because then again, when we didn't have any data about whether this was safe for kids, then again, parents won't give their kids the vaccines. Oh, vaccine hesitancy for the kids. I'm like, this again, we don't have any data. Why would we and then we got the data, and then people started vaccinating their kids. I was like,
It's true. And I think what do we do about this sort of, God, it's such a big question. But as an individual who works in science media, who's watching, amazing science communication on the one hand, and abysmal science communication on the other hand, I can only imagine, I don't have to only imagine, I feel the frustration day to day. But the question is, what do we do about that as media entities? Like, how do we change the way that we talk about these stories, the way that we talk about these massive public health issues, so that we are inducing or we are promoting positive public health, but at the same time, we are doing it in an empathic, kind of humanistic way, because I think sometimes that gets lost in the equation.
Yeah, I really wish when it came to a lot of the bad pandemic reporting, even sometimes science journalists that I usually respect were still doom and glooming. That was where I really see where we can do improvements. There was a lot of worst case scenario reporting, which I think the vaccine hesitancy fits into. But even more extreme examples saying before we knew at the very beginning, particularly, you saw examples of that, but I think it's a thread that has gone throughout the pandemic. When we didn't know, for example, let's say the death rate and people were saying these very high numbers, or we didn't know how contagious it was. And people were saying incredibly, they're like, well, I guess if it has the contagiousness of measles and it has the deadliness of Ebola, then all of a sudden we'd all be dead. And it was early on at Science Versus, we were reporting okay, there's not a lot we know about this virus, but what's the chance that this is literally the worst example of every other disease we've ever known about, all combined into a coronavirus? And the experts were like, yeah, that seems unlikely, And so I think we just kept it, like when you don't know something as a science journalist, don't assume the worst. And particularly not in the middle of a pandemic when people are already scared. You don't need to scare people into action when they're already in lockdown.
I think that's though what the motivation is, that they literally think, I've got to show people how bad it could be so that they go out and they do all these things that they're not doing.
Right.
Which is misguided.
Another example was like with the fomites, the concern at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know whether we needed to bleach our groceries. And there was this viral video of someone being like, this is how you shop in a pandemic, and you put your gloves on and you put all this, your PPE that even our like doctors and nurses don't have access to, and you go to the shops. And, at the time we didn't know, but we could still use our understanding of viruses more generally to make a more rational approach to what we needed to be doing. And we were washing our stuff, but again, it was this assumption that this was going to be the worst. This virus was going to be able to stick to surfaces and never leave. And it was like, okay, let's just take a step. What else do we know about coronaviruses? What do we know about other respiratory viruses? Like, let's be smart here. And just so many headlines predicting the worst. And I think that is something next pandemic, when you and I are made Lord of Science Journalism, that's something let's try and fix.
It's such a hard thing culturally to overcome, too, because we really live in an era. And when I say an era, it's been most of I just turned 38 last week. And so thank you. I was born in, kind of in the post-Reagan era was my youth. And, this is sort of the era of massive policy change with regard to how we present news in this country, because we used to have legislation that required that the news did not make money. The local news, right? Like when we looked at the classic kind of news hour on television, on the main television stations, it was not tied to advertising. Basically, the game shows and the, scripted series, they made the money that then offset the news. And there was all of these laws about like how much children's program needed to be educational, blah, blah, blah. It's like this fair broadcasting thing. And that all changed with Reagan. And now, there's no standard. I mean, there's a journalistic standard that's kind of self-imposed. But other than that, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And we know this. We've seen Facebook's algorithms. We look at the way that almost every large organization has to monetize their content. And it's like, if you get clicks, then you're going to be able to fund your news network, whether it's on the web, whether it's on television, whatever. And ultimately, what do people click on? Doom and gloom.
It is, what's interesting about actually, with our show, with Science Versus, we find, and I know that is, what you're saying, I would totally believe that within some media forms, and probably, I don't know, I don't have the data, so I shouldn't talk nonsense. But just curiously, with our show, we find that the most popular stories actually are the happy ones.
I love that. That makes me very happy. That makes me hopeful for humanity.
Yes. I like every time we do, because, I mentioned at the beginning of the show that sometimes I don't like doing like capital I important topics. But we do them because they are important, and they, now the show's been on for 11 seasons. So, we cover everything. And the topics where it's like a hard listen about, whether it's climate change or something that we haven't done wildfires yet, but we will, obviously it's very close to my heart being from Australia. Those kinds of like episodes don't do as well as, say, blue balls, the G-spot, magic mushrooms, dieting. People like love these stories that are lighter, that are kind of a little bit smaller, that you can have a giggle. Orgasms is one of our most popular episode. Not a bleed you can lead. Hopefully no one's bleeding at the time. You could just have a laugh and learn about, your clitoris. So that has been kind of nice because also when you're producing these episodes, it's much funner to be making an episode where everyone's having a giggle, including the scientists.
Yeah, for sure.
That speaks to me, because I have a subscription to the New York Times. and to The Economist. And it's funny because the New York Times, it's so Debbie Downer. You're right. It's so.
Oh, yeah. My morning briefing, sometimes I just blow right through them. I'm like, I can't. I don't have the bandwidth for this today.
Exactly. With The Economist, every now and then they'll have these like little funny things. I always find myself just going to them. These, little tidbits about a place in the world that I didn't know anything about. And it's just delightful. So maybe we've had so much it bleeds that we don't want it to bleed anymore. Maybe we just want, some beautiful discovery about a like marsupial in Australia.
Right. What is that?
That's in your news consumption.
You're so right. It's such a human thing. Like if I were to look at my Instagram, like, gosh, I shouldn't be admitting this out loud. Like I follow this pathologist named Mrs. Angemi, who it's basically just like dead body pictures. It's really like morbid and weird, but it's like you learn a lot about like weird pathology. And so it's a lot of like gross body stuff and then like puppies. Like it's like the two extreme ends of the spectrum.
Right.
Like, look at that cute puppy. Ooh, gross. Look at that boil. What are they going to do with it? Right? It's like, what is that about human nature that we go to these like very extreme places?
It's true. Yeah. But even that pathology one, it doesn't sound like it's being like, this is a blah, blah, blah. It sounds more like it's like, isn't the human body amazing? Look,
it's very educational. But it's also kind of like, I think she just gets that like, look at this gross thing is a good entree to learning for some people. And yes, it's very true. There are people like me are like, ooh, fascinated. I'm wondering, and I know that this is sort of a left turn, but maybe not. But you're in New York now. Obviously, you're still very closely tied to Australia. I don't know if you live there part-time or how often you go home. And I know the pandemic has made things quite strange. But have you noticed any big cultural... I mean, I've long felt like Australia is a very kindred country. I travel there probably every few years for work, and there are portions of Australia that are just like, I very much see like the Sydneys and the Melbournes, like the New Yorks and the LAs, but then I also see like the Perths and the other parts that like remind me of growing up in Texas, and it feels very paralleled with the US in obvious ways. But I can imagine as somebody who's really lived in both places, that you also see the big cultural differences. Is there anything that really struck you when you came to the US that you are still having a hard time getting used to, or that is, pretty jarring to you, especially in the context of bringing a show from an Australian sort of context and audience into a US context and audience?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, and I think about it a lot in the context of the stories we tell ourselves about where we're from. So there is this story that I could tell you about how Americans are quite individualistic and Australians care more about their society. That is a story that, for example, I read in a recent editorial about Australia, because Australia seems to have found its odd place in the conspiracy theory on the right about how terrible it is to live in Australia. And then part of this editorial was like, no, but we care about each other. And I
guess I never put Australia in the big bucket of collectivist countries. I put them more on the individualist side of the spectrum.
We definitely have a better safety net than you have in the States.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it's completely off the wall. And there was Australia's had a lot of lockdowns because the goal, while they never said it explicitly, the government never said it explicitly, basically they were trying to get down to COVID zero. Now Delta, that's been made incredibly difficult, but it did mean that in Australia, Sydney and Melbourne had been in lockdowns for extended periods of time. Friends really, not leaving their house to do anything other than, sport, shopping. It was way more extreme than the lockdowns that we had in New York at the beginning of the pandemic at its sort of scariest. So, and there was a little bit of pushback to that, but given how strong the lockdowns were, the pushback wasn't that much. I would have to say most people understood that as a community, we all need to get together and stay inside so that we don't have to deal with this virus.
Right. And I can imagine the framing was different. It was more like, I need to be careful because this threatens my livelihood, as opposed to, you don't have the right to tell me I have to wear a mask if I'm carrying an infectious disease.
Yes. There's a lot of, you do this for your team. Be a good mate.
Right.
Be a good mate.
Yeah, that argument doesn't always work here, does it?
No. And I think, so in some ways that story of collectivism, we're no Sweden, and probably Sweden is no Sweden as well. But on the other hand, I think you're right. There are a lot of similarities, and I think Australia is definitely moving in the direction of individualism as well.
Ew, do you think that's because of U.S. influence? Like, and when I say U.S. influence, I mean global U.S. influence.
I look. I mean, I'm just talking out of my ass here. I don't have any data, but
I don't know if there is data on something like that. Yeah, I don't know if you actually can measure something like this.
So, given we're in ass territory here, I would say that for a long time, at least, America has been the leader of the free world, so they say. But it has been a model country for what you can do. And I think in that way, it has sort of had this cultural influence. And I do think there is something to it. And it is really sad because, as you know, we have a lot of data about what some of the things that America does, that doesn't work. Healthcare is a prime example. We have so much data around that. And yet we still see in Australia and other countries, they're moving towards a more a model of healthcare that is less preventative, that's less, let's give big investments in the early days. Let's pay for going to see your GP. So it is really sad to see, because we could learn from America. We could learn from the mistakes America made.
Learn the inverse, the negative consequences.
Exactly.
But instead, we don't. What is that? Why is it that we go, well, that doesn't work, let's try it here?
Exactly.
What is that?
Is it just because we're allowed to? Is it that America gives us a pass? Well, they're kind of doing it over there and they're getting away with it.
Yeah, or it could be that for whatever reason, we're really good at marketing. We're really good at selling a toxic product. Like we saw during the housing crash of, what was that, 2007, 2008? We're really good at packaging something up and making it look like something that we should be investing in when it's actually garbage. I think that's what that is.
Candy corn. That's what it is.
Yes. America. Our healthcare is like candy corn. So what was that scary for you when you picked up and you moved here? Were you like, oh shit, I hope I don't get sick?
So I moved before the pandemic.
No, I just mean leaving an Australian system, which was a little bit more, as you mentioned, egalitarian, definitely had more of a safety net. I mean, I know from my friends who live in the UK that even when they come to visit, they pay for this exorbitant travel insurance because they're so scared of getting sick in the US.
Yes, no, it's very funny you mentioned it. I haven't thought about it for a little while, but when I first moved, I definitely had a lot of comfort in the fact that if I did get really sick and my insurance didn't cover it, because at the time, I always had insurance with my work. I was lucky like that. But I had no idea if it was good insurance. It ended up being good insurance, but I didn't know about any of that. And I always had comfort in knowing, well, I would just get the fuck out of here and go back to Australia. I'll never have to pay a bill, and a huge exorbitant bill, because I'll just leave and never come back and never pay that bill. And it's such an awful position to be in for someone who doesn't have that escape route. It's an awful situation that a country has gotten to, where people are coming and going well, if I get in trouble, I'll just go home.
No, but I get it. And my version of that is I grew up in Texas and I'm applying to internships for my PhD right now in psychology. And I'm looking at these different sites. I'm a psycho-oncologist. I work in a cancer ward. And I love doing cancer psychology and end of life work. And the only internship available that's APA accredited in my exact field is at MD Anderson in Texas. And I'm like, I can't go there. I can't go there because I don't have reproductive rights in Texas anymore. And I know it sounds crazy. And I know that there's...
It doesn't sound crazy. It doesn't sound crazy at all.
It's not a good chance that within that year I'm going to need to use services, but it's not worth it to me.
No, and it's the stress of living in that, even if you never needed those services, it's the stress of that year being like, if I do, what will I do?
Yeah, and I feel so heavy-hearted for all of my family and friends. I grew up there. I spent the first 25 years of my life there. My family still lives there, and it's just heartbreaking to me that this is the state of things. And so I can imagine that being here, you have something similar, well, at least I could go home. But you're right. Some people don't have that privilege to be able to go home.
And it's it's I don't know. It
And for
feels
some people, this is a better opportunity because they live in places where, well, that's not even true. Where other things are worse, maybe geopolitical conflict is worse. But the strange thing is, even in countries that are developing countries that are dealing with horrific geopolitical conflict, often they have better health care.
if you don't have a good insurance system, it's I know, and I was gonna say it feels like an intractable problem, and I'm like, no, it's not an intractable problem. Many countries around the world have found a solution.
Pretty much all of that. Yeah, it's like we're in the like tiny minority here that we don't have any sort of public health service or public education funding or child care funding or like all of these basic what are often viewed in many countries as basic human rights we don't fund here. But hey, Biden's looking to pass this new social package. I haven't done the deep dive into what it really entails and what its likelihood of passing is, but I'm excited to see that at least we're trying.
There's talk.
There's talk. We're trying because it's been a long time. Pretty much my entire life in this country has been work to try and undo a lot of Reagan era dismantling of these kinds of social systems. And it's I don't know, it's sad to think that I don't know how we even got off on this.
We just did an episode with Joycelyn Elders, who was the Surgeon General during the Bill Clinton era. Well, for a couple of years.
She was the masturbation lady.
Yes, and
I loved her.
Yes, you will still love her. She's amazing. She was, for those who don't remember, she was fired unceremoniously for an offhanded comment around masturbation, and then Bill Clinton fired her.
Right. This is supposed to be a pretty progressive president who did this.
Well,
it's supposed to be. That's a big air quotes
memory.
There.
I don't know.
Exactly.
And what was amazing interviewing her and also listening back to the speeches that she gave in the early 90s, literally those speeches could have been said today. She was talking about how important preventative healthcare is, about how we know how much cheaper it is to treat people before they get seriously ill, whereas the whole American healthcare system, she called it, this is her words, she was like, we don't have a healthcare system, we have a sick care system. We treat people once they're already sick. And everything, she was saying this decades ago. And I literally was like, wow, you could take this whole speech and present it today and it would still be news to people's ears because we still haven't solved these problems. And that I hear you. It's very depressing, particularly when there are so many other solutions out there. And it's just been politicized in this really gross way.
I'm interested in your take on that then. You mentioned this word politicized, and I think that it's such an important topic from going back to this very scientific perspective, right? Like the work that you do as a science podcaster, as a science communicator, as a science journalist. Okay, so I work on 2 podcasts, and I've also done a ton of science media over the years. And on my show, it's very me. Like these are my views, and I'm not going to be afraid to say them, right? And so I get ultra political. And then I'm a co-host of a show called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and the editorial policy on that show is that it's a bipartisan show. We have listeners from every end of the spectrum, and that we don't get overtly political. But my take and the frustration where I find myself kind of sometimes screaming is that I truly believe in my heart of hearts that science is political. I don't think you can separate the two. Well, I'm interested in your take on that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I agree with it in spirit, but I do not think that science is political. I think it has become politicized. Okay. So this would be my splitting of hairs with you. Mm-hmm. This is my. I was once going to be a lawyer, and I studied law, so I can see.
Oh, I love it. Okay, good. So give me the legal brief here.
I mean, it's not at all. I can just see this like real wanky side of my brain just kicking in right now. But I do feel like it is actually important, the distinction. So I think science, as all the listeners of your show know, and it's this process of discovery, of learning things about the world. You repeat it enough times, we think we've pretty much got an answer to something, and that answer may end up being something that the left doesn't like or the right doesn't like. Let's use an example. Like, so let's say preventative healthcare, for example. So we know we have, lots of data showing how important it is to catch things early, say diabetes, before it hits the really rough end of the scale, how much cheaper it is, how much easier it is to take care of people earlier on. Now, that is not a political statement. Say we have evidence of that. Now, what is political, though, is this idea, is socialized medicine, this idea of, that what has become politicized is this idea that, if you take care of a lot of people, if you increase taxes and then you use that money to help everyone, these are ideas that have become politicized. And so I think, so once you start taking a scientific finding and putting it on the political spectrum, that doesn't mean that science is political. It means it's been politicized.
Right. So your view is that there's sort of and I don't want to caricature it, but that there's like a I don't want to use the word pure, but I think you know what I mean. There's fundamental kind of scientific question that's asked that is, I guess my view is that it's not even asked in a vacuum. The people who are asking these questions and doing this research also are people with agendas and with views about the world.
Yes, I hear, but I guess my purist, when I put my purist hat on, you're right, of science, then, because I think when you start getting into questions around, like, yes, obviously scientists are human beings who are biased and can ask, questions in particular ways and can do kind of what I would call dodgy science. That's not true science to me. That's kind of like a messed up version of it. But when it's working right. So let's use the example of climate change again. Like, we have all this evidence, obviously, that climate change is real, that for some reason, which, we know the reasons, money, power, has now become a statement of the left that climate change is real and we need to have action on it. But there's nothing inherently left about that idea. And another example that I think is interesting in the context of America and Australia is, a lot of ideas around being a Republican or being on the right in America don't translate in Australia. Gun control would be an obvious one. So there's no real reason you could make one, but why, really like loving guns and wanting freedom around guns is an issue on the right. You could say, actually, if you're a true conservative and you're risk averse, then maybe you don't want guns around. Now, in Australia, you couldn't map gun control on a left or right scale. So that's what I mean by and if you want to then put the science question on it, we have data around how dangerous having too many guns around is. So
you do in Australia. Here we have very limited data because we weren't allowed to study it.
Right. But I guess we as a global community. So that's kind of what I mean by science isn't political, but it gets mapped that way. And then
it's interesting. Yeah.
So I do feel like it's important to separate it. And you're right that I'm not so naive that I think science is always exercised in a pure fashion, and we talk about that on the show as well. But I do think that is important.
Yeah, I guess where my sort of respectful pushback and disagreement comes into a place of sort of I think that that's the aspiration, but it's not necessarily the reality. And my example that I would bring up, kind of as you bring up climate change, which I think is a beautiful, if we were doing debate club and I was assigned to that team, I think climate change would also be my beautiful example of sort of a politically agnostic view that then becomes really politicized. But I think when we look at the history of, let's say, race science or intelligence testing, right, or any, we can then very clearly
evolutionary psychology, quote unquote,
or even evolutionary genetics. If you really think, I remember I brought this up recently on an episode, that there's a stunning picture. I saw a professor give a talk once, and I always feel so guilty because I don't remember who it was, and I can't find the photo. But the opening photo that he used was a snapshot in a periodical section of a library. Remember libraries? Remember university libraries where you would have the bound archive books of different periodicals. So the journal of this, the journal of that, and they're bound by year. And it showed the exact date when the annals of eugenics switched over to the annals of human genetics.
Right.
And it was a really like chilling photo that this is the same journal, but it had a different name because it was a different time, and the motivation for doing very similar science was just it was well accepted back then within the scientific community that white men were superior and that Black people, especially women, had inferior traits. This was literally talked about as if it was a known thing. And I think that's where my view that like the politicization of science, like it's almost inextricably linked. And you're right, there's an aspiration for doing pure science, but I think that in practice, it's never pure.
Never, not even when you're studying sort of
physics,
monkeys in the
cosmology
Congo or something. We've got an article coming out. We've got an episode coming out about this cool noise that monkeys make.
Right.
That.
And there's one scientist out there who's saying, no, this has to do it. No, it's true. I mean, that's the thing. I just think the vacuum mentality, and I think that this has come as I've moved out of neuroscience and into clinical psychology more and more, that I've grown to have a greater appreciation for the fact that it is always messier than I wanted it to be. And back when I was doing pure science evangelism and really talking about science as this sort of unblemished and very not esoteric, but very kind of clean process, that I was forgetting about the social justice component. And that
I do think though that even I do agree with you about this as something to consider, but I do think that at the same time, in the public's mind about the really controversial scientific issues of our time in terms of
you're putting
change.
That in quotes, right? Like controversial, like things that are not controversial within the sciences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like when I think about gun control, climate change, healthcare, those things. While you are right, we always have to be aware of this potential for bias in science and its horrible history in some respects. I think that in that sense, those areas aren't as politicized as sometimes people make out.
I think you're right. I think that's a very important point that you're making, that just like we were talking about before, where sometimes the media likes to focus on things that aren't really representative of reality because they're more flashy. They're more, putting that spin on the headline is something that is a common practice within the media. I think that there are things in science that are not controversial, yet to keep the story going, they're sold to us, wrapped up in this controversial window dressing.
So who wins in debate club?
we go split a pizza and
that sounds good.
Yeah, I think so. Like we go celebrate with some. I don't know. I've got food on the mind. I've been restricting my calories recently, so I'm like, hot fudge sundae
with a hot fudge sundae. That sounds good.
Yeah. Well, gosh, I can't, like, there's so much more that I would love to be able to talk to you about. I don't want to keep you any longer because I know that you have such a busy schedule. Wendy, I've had so much fun debating with you, but also, just learning about your process with science versus about some of the really cool episodes. Everybody, please go check it out. I'm just looking at your most recent episodes. I know that you mentioned the one that's coming up next, but that recently you have the episode about the legendary condom queen, which I love. I'm noticing that there was an episode recently about therapy, which, okay, that's like, I'm going to go listen to that right now. About weight loss, about childbirth, about the secret world of plants, about monogamy. These are all such and blue balls, of course, which you also mentioned. All such fascinating. And hey, I think important, sometimes a capital I, maybe a lowercase I, but whatever, it's all important.
That's right. I mean, we really came to a fun conclusion. So.
Yes, good. So thank you so much for being here with us, for sharing your enthusiasm and your excitement and your point of view. Before we go, I always ask my guests the same final two questions, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you. But before we dive into that very, very tiny, short last segment, I'm wondering if there's anything we didn't get to talk about, if there's anything that you want to kind of plug or mention for the audience.
No, I guess just go listen to Science Versus and do it on Spotify.
Science versus on Spotify. Important point. All right. So Wendy, at the very end of the show, I always ask all of my guests the same two questions. They're sort of big picture questions, but you are an expert in grappling with big picture questions. So I know these will be
Pressure's
not
on.
a match
Pressure's
for you.
On.
So we would like to know, number one, when you think about the future in whatever context feels relevant to you, so it could be really big picture stuff, like it could be like cosmic big picture stuff, or global stuff, or local stuff, or even just very personal stuff. The first thing that we want to know is, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night? The thing that you're most concerned about, worried, maybe even a bit pessimistic, maybe borderline cynical about. But then on the flip side of that, because we like to end on a more kind of positive and uplifting note, where are you finding your optimism these days? What are you genuinely and kind of authentically optimistic about?
I think that we are in the horrible acne-pocked teenage years of the internet, and that it is not going to get worse from here. So there's a lot of kind of talk. There is some studies on how social media is separating us and bubbles and everything's terrible, and you go online and conspiracy theories ahoy and there's nothing we can do about it and blah 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 blah. But I think that will eventually calm down. And when we think about how young the internet really is, how young social media is, it is in just its awkward teenage years. And I think we're kind of going to grow out of it. We're going to hit the 30s, the 30s of how we interact with the internet and what we do with it. And it's going to be just a little more chill.
Yeah. Yeah, 30s have been good to me so far. So yeah, the 30s of the internet, I think, are I am looking forward to that. You're right. I like it.
Great.
I like it. I get it. You said you're not that good at predicting the future. That's fair.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And of course, caveat to that. So forget everything I just said.
Oh. Well, Wendy, thank you so much. Everybody, the show is Science versus they take on fads, trends, and the opinionated mob to find out what's fact, what's not, and what's somewhere in between. By Gimlet Media, it is a Spotify original. And if you don't already subscribe, do it right now. Wendy, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.